Hi, I'm Tess, and this is Blind Crime. With cases like these, you'll never see it coming. Hey guys, and welcome back to Blind Crime. With cases like these, you'll never see it coming. I really struggled with what case to cover this week. With true crime, there's always something new to cover, but when everyone else is already covering it, it's like, what more can I bring to the table? Sometimes it's easy to be like, yeah, I want to cover that case. I don't care if somebody already did it. But then other times it's more like, why should I talk about that when so-and-so did such an amazing job at it? There's a balance, and I never want to steal a story from someone. Well, I don't think you can really steal the story. I don't want to copy anyone. Yeah, there's cases that I've covered and that I will cover that others have done, like the Anthill Kids and Gypsy Rose Blanchard. But doing the same breaking stories like the Moscow, Idaho murders or the Gilgo Beach killer or Delphi, those are being talked about and covered in such an extreme extent, it just doesn't make sense to me to cover them. Alas, here I am rambling about stuff that you probably don't care about. So we'll just jump right into our case this week. It was 1965. Exciting and tragic things were happening around the world. Lyndon B. Johnson was president. Malcolm X was assassinated. And Soviet Union cosmonaut Alexei Leonov was the first person to do a spacewalk. The world was changing, in some ways for the better, and in others for the worse. For the Likens family, their entire world would go up in flames without them even knowing. Life wasn't easy for the Likens family. Lester Likens was a man of many trades. He worked a number of odd jobs throughout his life, only having an 8th grade education. Lester was limited in his career options, though. He had tried owning and running a small restaurant at some point, but that was unsuccessful. He had found a niche in selling concessions at the county fair, though, and for the majority of his life, that's what he did. He would travel with the fair all across the country selling funnel cakes and cokes to fairgoers from his home state of Indiana all the way to California and then back down to Florida. In 1944, Lester met Elizabeth Grimes, who went by Betty. They quickly fell in love and got married and wasted no time in starting a family. Their firstborn was the first set of twins, Diana and Danny. Then came Sylvia, and finally, the last of the Likens children, another set of twins, Ginny and Benny. Their hands were full, but so were their hearts. Lester and Betty loved their children, and despite their minimal educations, they tried to provide for their family and raise their children right to the best of their ability. The Likens family were known for being somewhat of a drifter family. They traveled a lot, spending a lot of their time out in California. As time went on, though, Lester and Betty's financial struggles would eventually put too much strain on their relationship, and in early 1965, the two would separate. While separated, Betty would be arrested for shoplifting a pair of shorts from a clothing store, leaving the kids to fend for themselves. The kids usually came to Lester's home after school, but this day, when he returned home from work, no one was there. A neighbor informed him that Sylvia, 16 at the time, and Jenny, 14, had been to the home with some friends, and then they had gone to the friend's home a couple of blocks away. Lester went to find the girls, and when he arrived, Sylvia and Ginny told him what had happened with Betty. Lester broke down in tears, saying to the mother of the children Sylvia and Ginny had been visiting with that he loved his wife, if only they could make money and reconcile their relationship. Lester called the police station, but Betty wasn't there. He went to her apartment, but she wasn't there either. He looked all over for her, but she was nowhere to be found. He returned to the home the girls had been at, and the mother invited Lester and his sons, Sylvia and Ginny's brothers, as well as the girls, to stay the night. They obliged. The next morning, Betty was found at her parents' house, and Lester decided that it was time to make a change. He told Betty that they could go back to traveling with the fair so that they could make money for their family and be together again. They'd have to find lodging for the kids. The fair was no safe place to raise your children, but they decided it was their best option. A few days later, Lester and Betty returned to the home of the friends Sylvia and Ginny had made to thank the mother for her kindness and hospitality to them a few nights before. Lester told the mother that they were going to be joining the traveling fair again and that the children were going to be staying with their grandparents in Lebanon, Indiana, a half-hour drive from Indianapolis. Lester and Betty voiced some concern over this, though. The oldest of the Likens children, Diana, had already moved out. She had gotten married and was living somewhere in town close by. But the rest of the children were still at home. Lester and Betty were worried that 4 children would be too much for their grandparents. The mother of the house in which they were standing then offered to take in Sylvia and Ginny for $20 a week. The Likens thought that this was an amazing idea and immediately agreed to it. The girls were thrilled. They'd made these new friends, and now they were going to get to live with them. It was like a dream come true. A dream that would tragically become their worst nightmare. The Baniszewski family was not one of love and happiness. The mother, Gertrude, was what I imagine most people in the 60s would consider white trash. She had 7 children, the youngest being fathered by an underage boy. Gertrude had actually been pregnant 13 times, but tragically miscarried 6 of those times, the most recent being in April of 1965. She wasn't a pretty woman, but she knew how to seduce the male species with her striptease dances and crude talk of sex. Gertrude had been married at a young age to the father of her eldest 6 children, but they divorced several years later. And when things didn't work out with Gertrude's boyfriend after the divorce, Gertrude returned to her ex-husband and they married again, having 2 more children before finally calling it quits for good. This time, Gertrude seduced a young man who was under 18 and became pregnant shortly after. This pregnancy did go full term, and this was the last of the children Gertrude would bear. The names of most of the children are not on public record that I can find due to their ages. When this case occurred, the oldest of the children was Paula, who was 17 at the time, another daughter named Stephanie, and a son named John. It was Paula and Stephanie who Sylvia and Ginny had become friends with the day that their mother was arrested for shoplifting. Gertrude didn't have a consistent job despite having so many children. She relied on child support from her ex-husband and the income from her younger lovers, as well as an on and off again ironing job she did in between her quote-unquote health problems. She was asthmatic and suffered from frequent bronchitis, which made it difficult for her to breathe. Because of the lack of income in the house, food was scarce, most meals being toast and soup. The children dressed in whatever clothes they could find that would fit them. They were a wild family, kids coming and going from all over the neighborhood. Gertrude always wearing skimpy clothes around the teenage boys, hoping to entice them just enough to get them to come back again. While Gertrude herself was willing to show off some skin to the young men in the area, she was strict with her daughters about what they wore and constantly lectured them on premarital sex and being promiscuous. The oldest daughter, Paula, had run off with a married man in early 1965 and was missing for months before she finally returned home. When she did, she was 2 months pregnant. Gertrude had no idea. When the Likens family came into their lives, they were all excited. The girls were excited to have new friends, and Gertrude was looking for any potential way to earn money that didn't involve actually working. When she offered to board Sylvia and Jenny, she was beside herself with the thought of having $20 extra a week to spend on whatever. The excitement for the family would soon wear off, though, and what has been dubbed as the Indiana House of Torture would erect itself and be a staple in history in America. August of 1965, Lester and Betty dropped their girls off at the Baniszewski home, giving Gertrude her first payment of $20. It would only be a few months before the Likens family would be reunited again. Lester and Betty kissed their girls goodbye, never walking through the house to see where they would be staying other than the living room. If they had just walked through the home, they would have seen that the house was covered in filth. Layers upon layers of dirt thickly coated every surface in the home. There was no stove, no microwave, and in the pantry, only a loaf of bread and a box of saltine crackers. The kitchen had only 3 plates, 3 bowls, and 3 cups. 3 spoons were the only utensils to eat with, and as time went on, 2 of those spoons would be lost. Upstairs in the bedroom, the 7 children would take turns sleeping on the bed. You see, there was only 4 mattresses in the entire house. At this time, Sylvia was not enrolled in school. She had dropped out on her 16th birthday, just like her mother, and instead tried to do odd jobs to help bring in money and help take care of the house. She was diligent at doing her chores and keeping the home tidy. Her mother always appreciated her help, but in the Baniszewski home, her efforts were far from even acknowledged. Jenny was in school, and she always studied and worked hard. Some of the Baniszewski children were in school and others weren't. Some helped with their mother's ironing job. Paula worked at a local drugstore during the day and went to school at night. Eventually, though, she would be fired from the drugstore, the owner saying she wasn't mature enough for the job. Even with the extra $20 a week, though, Gertrude was struggling financially. As I said before, food was scarce in the house. Breakfast consisted of toast and butter, lunch was never served, and dinner was usually a broth or a soup of some sort. Sylvia would end up taking a job a few weeks later working at the high school in the cafeteria just so she could get a decent meal every day. While working at the school, she decided to re-enroll herself and finish high school, if for no other reason to get out of the house during the day. So far, Sylvia didn't dislike Gertrude or the family, but she was being treated a bit differently than her sister Jenny. See, Jenny was small. When she was just a small child, she had come down with polio, and as a result, she ended up developing problems with her legs and was in a metal leg brace. She struggled to get around, but she didn't let her leg brace stop her from doing anything. Jenny was also pretty, like Sylvia. Sylvia had dark, curly hair and big brown eyes. Jenny was blonde, kind of a dirty blonde, but she also had big brown eyes. Sylvia was more matured physically than Jenny, but they were both beautiful young women. Jenny wasn't treated well, but in the short time the girls had been in the Baniszewski home, Jenny hadn't been paddled yet. Sylvia, on the other hand, had. The girls had just tried to keep their noses to the ground and do what they were told, hoping and praying that time would pass quickly where they could go back home to their parents. Sylvia and Jenny both were good girls. They weren't perfect, but they were good. Sylvia had brought a Bible with her to the Baniszewski house, and she often went to Sunday school and church on Sunday mornings. She had been saved and baptized 2 years before, and going to church was one of her favorite things. Jenny would often go with her, whether to hear the message or just hang out with her big sister, but she also enjoyed the outings. They would dress in their finest dresses and make sure their hair was in perfect place before walking down the street to the church. The pastor of the church enjoyed talking with Sylvia and Jenny after services, and Sylvia became one of the best students in Sunday school. She always had something to say or a question to ask, always curious about the Bible and what God would think about certain things. From what I could find, the Baniszewski family weren't really involved much in church unless there was a free meal being offered. Some of the children went here and there, but they weren't regular attendees like Sylvia and Jenny. As summer began to fade and fall began to emerge, things in the temporary home of Sylvia and Jenny started to change. Some of the older children in the home began picking on Sylvia. You see, when she was a child, she'd been playing with one of her brothers, and they butted heads. Sylvia hit her mouth on her brother's head, and in doing so, she lost one of her front teeth. Sylvia was self-conscious about this, and more often than not, she would smile with her mouth closed. When the kids in the home found out about her missing tooth, they started poking fun at her, saying that she would never have a boyfriend and that she wasn't pretty. Sylvia defended herself, saying that she, in fact, had a boyfriend back in California and that she missed him. They weren't still dating, but they had kept in touch, and, she missed him. When Gertrude found out about this, she asked Sylvia if she'd ever done anything with the boy. Sylvia told Gertrude she guessed she had, but she wasn't really sure. Sex wasn't something that she had talked about before, at least not in great detail. Gertrude pressed further and asked if Sylvia had ever, quote, been under a blanket with a boy. Embarrassed, Sylvia said she had. Gertrude began to yell and scream at her, saying that she was immoral and a prostitute, that sex before marriage was a sin, and that Sylvia lost her virtue. Every day, she was lectured on being a whore and sleeping around and being easy. Paul even told Gertrude that Sylvia was pregnant in hopes of covering up her own pregnancy a little while longer. Around 2 weeks after Sylvia and Jenny had first come to the Baniszewski home, their father's next $20 failed to arrive. Gertrude took both Sylvia and Jenny into a room where she began to yell and scream, calling them bitches and saying she had taken care of them for a week for nothing. She forced them to pull down their bottoms and underwear and proceeded to paddle them mercilessly until they were both bruised and blistered. After this, things only kept getting worse for the Likens girls. The next week, Sylvia and Jenny had wanted to buy some candy, and they were told that if they collected glass soda bottles, they could turn those in for money. After going through the trash around the neighborhood and collecting enough bottles, they were able to get enough money for their candy and didn't think anything else of it. When they returned to the home that evening, Gertrude accused the girls of stealing the candy, and when Sylvia explained what had happened and how they got the money, Gertrude accused her of lying and again beat her with the paddle. Another week went by, and while at a church picnic, the Baniszewski children noticed that Sylvia had gone back to the table of food to get seconds. When they returned home, they told Gertrude that Sylvia had eaten a lot of food, and Gertrude beat Sylvia again, saying that how dare she do something that would wreck her body like that. Sylvia only wished her punishments would have ended there. Gertrude made Sylvia eat a hot dog that was flooded with ketchup, mustard, and what other random condiments they had in the house. Sylvia got sick and threw up, and instead of just leaving her be, Gertrude made Sylvia scoop up the vomit in her hands and eat that too. Lester and Betty made visits back home whenever they could to check on the kids and make sure everything was going okay. When they would show up, Lester always gave Gertrude another $20 and usually paid her in advance for another week while he was there. You would think that when the girls saw their parents that they would have told them what had happened and what had been going on. But Gertrude had promised them that if they said anything, she would make their lives a living hell afterwards. Scared for herself and for her sister, Sylvia never mentioned any of the beatings or the vomit or anything else that happened. Later in August of that year, one of the Baniszewski siblings had overheard Sylvia telling Paula that she had let her boyfriend in California feel her up. Whether this was true or Sylvia was just trying to seem cool to an older and pregnant Paula, I don't know. When the sibling told Gertrude about this, Gertrude then beat Sylvia once again, calling her a prostitute and a whore and kicking her in the vagina. After the beating, Sylvia tried to sit in a chair, where Paula forced her out and said she wasn't fit to sit in a chair. After this, the only time Sylvia was allowed to sit in a chair is if she had direct permission from Gertrude. It was after this incident that Gertrude then gave the other kids in the house, as well as anyone who else came into the house, permission to beat Sylvia and berate her in whatever way they pleased. She became a rag doll for the family to throw and kick around, a toy for them to take all their aggression out on. In a way to get back at the Baniszewskis, Sylvia and Jenny began a rumor at school that they had seen Paula and Stephanie, Paula's younger sister, exchange sex for money. And this would be the beginning of the end for Sylvia. Gertrude told Stephanie's boyfriend at the time, Coy Hubert, about the rumor Sylvia had started about her and Paula, and told him he had permission to beat her for it. Coy was practicing jujitsu, the Japanese art of fighting and self-defense, and basically started to use Sylvia as his practice dummy. Gertrude even convinced Sylvia's best friend at that time that Sylvia was spreading rumors about her mother, provoking her friend to attack her. A fist fight broke out between the girls, and Gertrude then instructed Jenny to start punching Sylvia in the face. When Jenny refused, Gertrude punched Jenny in her face until Jenny finally relented and began hitting her sister. It wasn't just the neighborhood kids who knew Sylvia was being beaten, though. A family moved into the house next door to the Baniszewski residence and quickly noticed the parade of children coming in and out of the home. Mr. and Mrs. Vermillion were a young married couple with an infant child. They both were employed at the time, and Mrs. Vermillion thought that if their neighbor had so many kids coming and going, then surely she was a good caretaker. Mr. Vermillion decided to host a barbecue in their backyard so that they could get to know Gertrude and her family. At the gathering, Mrs. Vermillion noticed that Sylvia had a black eye and asked what happened. Paula was standing nearby and was very proud to announce that she had been the one to give Sylvia the black eye. Not only that, but a few moments later, she walked up to Sylvia with a glass of boiling hot water and threw it in Sylvia's face. A short time later, Mrs. Vermillion went over to the house again and noticed that Sylvia had yet another black eye. This time, it was so bad her eye was completely swollen shut. Her lips were also swollen and bruised, and she was wandering around the house in something of a daze. Again, Paula stepped forward, removing her belt and showing Mrs. Vermillion exactly how Sylvia ended up looking like she did. Mrs. Vermillion left the house, neither she nor her husband reporting what they had seen done to Sylvia to the police. And they never left their child in the care of Gertrude. A short time later, Sylvia had told Gertrude that she needed a sweatsuit for gym class at school, but Gertrude told her that they couldn't afford one. Sylvia did decide to steal one from the school, and when Gertrude found out, she again beat Sylvia, kicking her repeatedly in the vagina and burning her fingertips with a cigarette. She then gave permission to the children in the house who smoked to use Sylvia as an ashtray. Her body would be covered in round red burns in the matter of hours. One afternoon, shortly after this, Sylvia went out to sell more soda bottles. When she returned, Gertrude began accusing her of being a prostitute. How else could she get money? To punish her, and I'm going to give a trigger warning for sexual violence here, Gertrude made Sylvia strip down, completely nude, naked in front of her sons and the neighborhood boys who were at the house. When she was naked, Gertrude gave Sylvia an empty glass soda bottle, and forced her under the threat of beating Jenny to masturbate with the bottle in front of everyone. Stephanie had come home from school while this was going on, and in a rage, thinking that Sylvia was putting on some kind of show in front of her boyfriend, walked over to Sylvia and hit her so hard, Stephanie's wrist broke. Due to the severity of the beating Sylvia had endured and the trauma caused by the glass soda bottle, she sustained kidney damage and was unable to control her bladder. She would frequently wet herself, usually while trying to sleep. Because of this, Gertrude decided that Sylvia was more like an untrained puppy than a human and sent her to live out the rest of her short life in the basement, where she would be kept naked, starved, and constantly humiliated. The Baniszewski children made Sylvia a mockery of the neighborhood, taking money from neighborhood kids who wanted to see a naked girl. They would charge more for anyone who wanted to hit or push Sylvia down the stairs. Sylvia was fed very little, less than what she had been allowed to eat before, and when she was able to eat, it was usually soup that she was only allowed to eat with her fingers, and under a strict time limit that wouldn't allow her to get very much of it down. While she wasn't allowed to eat very much food, she was allowed to eat her own feces and drink her own urine. Gertrude gave her a container to collect her remnants in, and that was her main source of sustenance. Because Sylvia was suffering from kidney damage and was being forced to use the bathroom in containers rather than a toilet, Gertrude started calling her Dirty Girl and evoked a new cleaning routine for Sylvia. This routine would happen once or more a day most days and consisted of Sylvia essentially being hog-tied and dunked into a bathtub of scalding hot water. After her quote-unquote bath, Paula would take salt and rub it all over Sylvia's body, making sure each and every one of her open wounds had salt in it. The suffering was never ending, or so it seemed to be. Ricky Hobbs, a 14-year-old boy in the neighborhood, became a frequent visitor to the Baniszewski home. Seduced by Gertrude during one of her striptease performances, Ricky became Gertrude's right-hand man, doing anything and everything that Gertrude told him to do to Sylvia. The speculation arose that Ricky became Gertrude's newest and youngest lover. He had never been in any kind of trouble before. He was an honor student, and by all accounts, he was a well-behaved kid. His mother was dying of cancer, and while she was on her deathbed, he was torturing Sylvia, all under his lover's command. Around this time, Jenny had been able to meet up with her older sister, Diana. She tried to tell Diana that her and Sylvia were being beaten and that they were very scared and unhappy, but Diana didn't believe her. She assumed that the girls had simply acted up and gotten in trouble, and they were frustrated because they had been punished. Another neighbor kid, Judy Duke, saw Sylvia and told her mother of the horrors that were taking place in the home. Judy's mother replied that bad kids get bad punishments and to leave it alone. More and more people began to find out about Sylvia and the condition that she was in, yet not one single person ever said anything to police or a teacher or anything. It was all kept under wraps, swept under the rug, ignored completely, or not taken seriously. The reverend of the church Sylvia had been attending had come by the home to see her because she had not been in service in a few weeks, and he was concerned. Gertrude made a pot of coffee and the two sat and talked, Gertrude telling Reverend Julian that Sylvia was a burden to her, that she was a prostitute who sold herself to married men and had found herself pregnant. Reverend Julian did not see Sylvia that day, but had prayed with Gertrude for Sylvia's salvation and for her life to turn around. Later, Reverend Julian would come by again to tell Gertrude that it wasn't Sylvia who was pregnant, rather her own daughter Paula. Gertrude refused to believe this, saying that Sylvia was the one who was pregnant, her daughter was a virgin, and Sylvia was trying to make her daughter look bad. Diana had come by a few weeks later to see her sisters, and Gertrude refused to let her in the house. She told Diana that Lester had written and given strict instruction not to let Diana see the girls. Diana didn't buy this, though, and left, but hid outside in the bushes until she saw Jenny. When Diana approached Jenny, Jenny told her that she couldn't talk to her and ran back inside. Concerned now, she made a phone call, and a few days later, either a social worker or a nurse, depending on where you read, showed up at the house to speak to Sylvia. Gertrude told the woman that she had been forced to send Sylvia to a juvenile home for teens because her behavior was so uncontrollable. The woman didn't ask many questions, but did see Jenny and noted that Jenny looked scared, but in her report said no more visits were needed to be made to the home. Police were called to the home on October 20th by Gertrude, claiming someone in the neighborhood had broken into her home and stolen from her. He was at her home, and she was scared for herself and for her children. Robert Bruce Harlan was actually there because he had caught her kids in his house stealing and was demanding his belongings to be returned to him. He was trying to sneak into the basement and get his things back when he was caught. Gertrude refused and flipped the script, calling the police on him. Mrs. Vermillion had seen the Banazuski children at Hanlon's home and made a call to police, taking Hanlon's side in the event. Despite being on the phone with police, no mention was made to Sylvia by Mrs. Vermillion yet again. And I just want to say, you can call the police to defend somebody who you technically saw trying to get into the basement of another person's home, but you're not going to call the police whenever you see someone, physically abusing another human being. This Mrs. Vermillion lady is just as bad. The next day, Gertrude had some of the kids bring Sylvia up from the basement and tie her to a bed, telling her that if she made it through the night without wetting the bed, she would no longer have to sleep in the basement. Sylvia asked Jenny to get her a glass of water, which she did, and Sylvia drank it to the last drop. Sylvia wet the bed that night. I think she did this just out of spite, personally. When they awoke the next morning to find Sylvia in a pool of her own urine on the bed, Gertrude lost it on her once again and beat her. During the beating, Gertrude started on about the rumors that Sylvia had started about Paula and Stephanie weeks before, saying that she had, quote, branded her daughters, and now Sylvia was going to be branded too. She raped Sylvia's clothes off and had the others tie her down to the bed and gag her. One of the children got a sewing needle and a box of matches and began striking the matches, letting the needle seethe in the fire until it was glowing orange. Gertrude then took the needle and began carving the letters I and M into Sylvia's stomach. After a few moments, she turned to her henchman, Ricky Hobbs, and asked him to finish the job. After asking how to spell what she wanted carved into Sylvia's skin, Gertrude wrote down the sentence, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," on a piece of paper, and let the boy get to work. It would later be found that this branding would cause Sylvia third-degree burns that even a plastic surgeon wouldn't have been able to fix. Gertrude was pleased with this at-home tattoo and left, but the Banazuski children had even more plans for Sylvia. They decided she needed a large S on her chest, either to stand for slave or Sylvia. The reason really isn't known. And so Ricky Hobbs began the process. After finishing the top curve of the S, he told Jenny to finish the job. When he refused, one of the younger Banazuski children stepped in. However, instead of completing the bottom curve of the S, She mistakenly went in the opposite direction, leaving Sylvia with a giant number 3 in the middle of her chest. Pleased enough with their work, the children left, leaving only Sylvia and Ginny in the room. Sylvia was beyond the point of feeling pain. Her body was slowly beginning to shut down, and she told her little sister, quote, "I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die." Ginny wept by her sister's side, unable to deny the inevitable truth. As the night went on, Gertrude instructed one of the boys to bring Sylvia upstairs, where she and Paula gave her a warm bath, not a scalding one, and actually washed her with soap and a washcloth. Afterwards, Sylvia was allowed to sleep in a bed, sleeping until late in the afternoon on October 23rd. When she did wake up, Gertrude and Paula had her write a letter to her parents. The letter reads as follows. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Likens, I went with a gang of boys in the middle of the night, and they said that they would pay me if I would give them something. So I got in the car, and they all got what they wanted. And when they got finished, they beat me up and left sores on my face and all over my body. And they also put on my stomach, 'I am a prostitute and proud of it.' I have done just about everything that I could do to make Gertie mad and cause Gertie more money than she's got. I've tore up a new mattress and peed on it. I have also cost Gertie doctor bills that she really can't pay and made Gertie a nervous wreck and all of her kids." Gertrude had decided that it would be better if Sylvia was disposed of, not necessarily killed, but taken away from the house into the woods and left to find her way to help, if she could find her way to help. Otherwise, she would be left for dead outside of the house. Her son, John Jr., and Ginny were going to take Sylvia into the woods and then come back home. The letter was to be left in the house as an attempt to look like a runaway letter. Sylvia had overheard this plan and, knowing she was going to die either way, tried to make a quick escape. What did she have to lose, anyways? She tried to run for the front door, but in her beaten and battered state, she could only move so fast. Before reaching the door, Gertrude caught her by the arm and pulled her back into the kitchen, where she sat Sylvia down at the table. Gertrude made Sylvia some toast, but Sylvia couldn't eat. For wasting her food, Gertrude ripped down the curtain rod above the kitchen window and began to whack Sylvia's mouth. Ricky Hobbs took Sylvia back to the basement and tied her up. Gertrude then brought her down a plate of crackers. Sylvia may have been slowly dying, but her ability to make a smart remark was still holding strong. When offered the crackers, Sylvia said, quote, "Feed them to the dog. It's hungrier than I am." Gertrude then, once again, began punching Sylvia in the face and stomach, leaving her once more in the basement. More beatings would take place over the next 24 hours. Gertrude would attempt to beat Sylvia with a chair and miss, hitting the wall, then try to paddle Sylvia, only to swing too widely and have it come back and blacken her own eye. A taste of her own medicine, perhaps. On October 25th, Sylvia would spend the entire night beating the basement floor with a broken broom handle, causing a lot of noise and ruckus. Some of the neighbors considered calling the police, but never did. And once again, Sylvia was ignored. The morning of October 26th, 1965, Stephanie and Ricky Hobbs would bring Sylvia upstairs to give her a bath under Gertrude's instruction. They laid her in the tub with all of her clothes still on, but before they started running the water, they noticed that Sylvia wasn't breathing. Stephanie attempted to do CPR on Sylvia, but she wasn't able to restart her heart. Gertrude didn't have a landline in the house, so she told Ricky to go to the nearest payphone and call 911. While Stephanie was doing CPR and Ricky was on the phone with dispatchers, Gertrude got the letter she had made Sylvia write a few nights before. When the paramedics and police arrived at the home, Sylvia had already died. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Gertrude gave police the letter, but in all the commotion, Jenny was able to pull one of the officers inside and say, quote, "Get me out of here and I'll tell you what really happened." Somehow or another, the death of Sylvia shocked the Baniszewski household. Paula, Stephanie, Ricky Hobbs, and Corey Hubert were all in disbelief that Sylvia was actually dead. After speaking with the police, Diana was called and Jenny was taken to her house so she could be safe for the night. In the middle of the night, while in a hotel in Florida, the phone rang. Lester Likens answered the phone, still half asleep. After hearing the words that his daughter was dead, he and Betty barely made it out of the hotel room with clothes on. They made it back to the fairgrounds where a fellow carny gave them a ride to the nearest bus stop. Their trip home would be long and agonizing, guilt and regret seeping strongly from their souls. Everyone who was at the scene of the crime knew that this was not a runaway-turned-gang attack. Sylvia's body had more injuries than the paramedics had ever seen. The autopsy revealed that Sylvia had over 100 cigarette burns over her body. Her top and bottom lip had been bitten completely through, leaving it almost severed. Her vaginal canal was so swollen it was almost sealed shut. She had severe bruising internally and externally. She had suffered second and third degree burns. Her kidneys had been damaged. She had suffered nerve damage. She was malnourished and dehydrated. She had suffered traumatic injuries to the brain. And she was not pregnant, despite what Gertrude had insisted. Sylvia's cause of death was brain swelling, brain hemorrhage, and shock. I'll be honest, I got confused while researching when it came to the charges and the trial and the sentencing in this case. It wasn't just Gertrude who was charged. She was charged with first-degree murder, but Paula, John, Coy Hubert, and Ricky Hobbs were all charged with injury to person as well. Others were also charged, but their charges were later dropped. Stephanie Baniszewski was also charged but had a separate trial. The trial of Gertrude, Paula, John, Coy, and Ricky were a package deal. During the trial, proceedings had to stop one day because Paula went into labor. Finally, after 9 months of lying about it, the truth came out. Scarily, Paula named the baby girl after her mother, Gertrude. The trial was a mess with delays and motions to dismiss and stays and postponements. The fact that each individual charged had their own lawyer also complicated the matter. Some of the lawyers tried to get separate trials for their clients, but ultimately the judge decided to try them all at once. Testimonies were made difficult because some things happened and were said in the presence of others and some weren't. Hearsay and objections and everything. It was just a mess. Witnesses, including Sylvia's parents, weren't allowed to be in the courtroom while they were giving testimony. The only person who was allowed to stay in the courtroom was Jenny, and I'm not even 100% sure why that is. Questions were raised against Lester and Betty. Why didn't you inspect the house before you left your children there? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Jenny was asked several times why she never told anyone what was happening. She said she tried to tell her sister, but Diana didn't believe her. She was too afraid to tell anyone else out of fear that either she wouldn't be believed or that Gertrude would then do to her what she had done to Sylvia. Gertrude would try to blame Sylvia's death on the kids. When that didn't work, she claimed she was not guilty by reason of insanity. She claimed the excess stress of 2 additional children, the financial stresses of being a single mom with 7 kids, her health, not allowing her to work, caused her to have a mental break. Mind you, Letitia Stout also claimed this defense and was found guilty in 2023 of murdering her stepson Gannon. Insanity doesn't get you off the hook, people. It didn't work for good old Gertie. It didn't work for loony Letitia. It's a lazy way to try to get out of your own actions. Gertrude's lawyer then tried to blame the kids, saying that Gertrude was chronically ill and couldn't stop her children from doing what they did, that she wasn't well-minded due to her heavy medication use because of her chronic illness. What a crock. The state wanted to pursue the death penalty for all of the people charged, including Ricky Hobbs and John Benazuski, who were only 14 and 15 at the time. In the end, Gertrude Benazuski was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The people of Indiana were shocked when the sentencing came. Indiana was a death penalty state, and murder charges were, by law, death penalty sentences. This was a first. She appealed, had a new trial, but was found guilty again. This time, she was sentenced to 18 years to life. After serving 18 years, she was eligible for parole. Despite the efforts of the Likens family and residents of the state of Indiana fighting to keep her in prison, Gertrude was released on parole in December of 1985. She moved out of state, changing her name to Nadine Van Fossen. Gertrude would make a statement after her release saying she didn't know what happened to Sylvia because she was on drugs at the time, but she took full responsibility for Sylvia's death. Gertrude died in 1990 of lung cancer. Paula was initially charged with second-degree murder, but she filed an appeal. Her appeal was granted, a new trial was set, but before the trial started, she took a plea deal. She pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter. She was sentenced to 3 years and was released on parole after her sentence. After her release, she moved out of state and changed her name to Paula Pace. She went on to school and became a teacher's aide, where she eventually was suspended after word got out of her involvement in Sylvia's murder. John, Ricky Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard were found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and each served 18 months. After his release, John changed his name to John Blake. He would become a truck driver, then later on would get his real estate license. He lived a normal life, eventually getting married and having a family. He never had another encounter with the law and pretty much lived under the radar. He made one public statement in 1990, sometime after the Jonesboro massacre, saying that he took full responsibility for his actions and part in Sylvia's death, and that a harsher sentence on his part would have been more justified than the 18 months that he served. No information was available for Ricky Hobbs or Coy Hubbard. I watched An American Crime last year, and it kept me up at night after I watched it. It haunted me in a sense. I think it was the way that it ended, but the entire story was just so horrific and so evil. I say it every week, I think, but I don't understand how people can be so truly evil. It just astounds me. It also infuriates me that so many people knew that at least something was going on, like the Vermillions, and they didn't say anything. They just ignored it. Even Diana didn't take Jenny seriously. I will say that I didn't cover every single detail of this case, and there are some differing reports of what happened in certain events. The majority of what I covered came from House of Evil by John Dean, which was adapted into the movie An American Crime. I think that this is probably the most well-researched case that I've ever done. And I want to thank Robert Palmer from the Broken System podcast for helping me find the right sources to get information. He's been a huge help in general in the last few weeks, and just getting the podcast up and running again and finding a new hosting website. Robert has been just truly amazing, and I cannot express my gratitude enough. If you haven't listened to the Broken System podcast, go check it out. I'll have a link for it in the description. I want to thank you all for listening to this week's episode, and as always, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. If you're already subscribed, then you must at least kind of like what you hear, So drop me a review. Share it with your true crime loving friends. All right, guys, that's all I have for this week. So until next week, keep your eyes open.